Hi guys, welcome to all. Today's very interesting topic, testing of hypothesis. If you are start research and if you want proposal for research, and there are the variables, and also this lecture cover the testing of hypothesis and also what is the hypothesis and characteristics of hypothesis, and also there are the different significance characteristics, and also alternative hypothesis, the level of significance. I will explain their error, some testing of hypothesis, and also important parametric test. So the important parametric test are Z test, T test, and X test and F test. So today's topic is very relevant for research, and if you are new, must will subscribe my channel, and don't forget press bell icon. So start today's topic, testing of hypothesis. Basically, in most cases the hypothesis is through to be the most important tool in research, and it is major purpose is to generate fresh idea for experiment and observations. Many experiments are conducted with the express purpose of testing hypothesis. So decision maker frequently encounter scenario in which they want to test hypothesis based on variables data, and then take decision based on the results. In social science, where direct knowledge of population parameters is uncommon, hypothesis testing is a common approach for determining if sample data support a theory sufficiently to allow generalization. As a result of hypothesis testing, we can make probability claim about population parameters. So although their theory cannot be verified beyond a responsible doubt in practice also, and also if it has passed critical testing, it is accepted. And before we go into how hypotheses are tested using the various tests designed for the purpose, it is important to first define what a hypothesis is and concept that go with it, so that we may better comprehends the hypothesis testing approach. So first of all, I discuss about the what is hypothesis. Basically, when people talk about hypothesis, they usually mean a simple assumption or a supposition that has to be proven to or rejected. A hypothesis, on the other hand, is a formal inquiry that a researcher want to answer, and as a result, a hypothesis can be described as a proportion or a series of proportion, but put out as a explanation for the occurrence of a certain group of occurrence, either as a provisional guesses to lead some inquiry, or as highly probable in the light of known as fact. A research hypothesis is frequently a predicted statement that connects an independent variable to a dependent variable, and may be tested using scientific procedure also. And students who receive counseling will show a greater increase in the creativity than student not receiving the counseling, or the automobiles A is prefer as well as the automobile B. So first the what is the characteristics of hypothesis. Basically, the hypothesis should be specific and clear, and if the hypothesis is not clear and explicit, and there are the conclusion obtained from it cannot be trusted. So the hypothesis must be able to be tested, and many times research programs have become bogged down in the swamp and unstable theories, and the researcher may conduct some preliminary research in order to make the idea testable. A hypothesis is testable if it can lead to additional deduction, and which may then be validated or refuted by the observation. If the hypothesis is a relational hypothesis, it should state the relationship between variables. So there are very interesting. Another, their hypothesis should be specific and limited in scope. A researcher must keep in mind that narrower and hypotheses are more testable, and he should develop them. And hypothesis should be communicated in a basic manner as feasible to, so that all parties involved can grasp. And however, it important realize that the simplicity of a hypothesis has nothing to do with its importance. And also, hypothesis must be consistent with the majority of known facts and with a large body of established fact. And to put it another way, and it should be that one that judge believed is the most flexible, and the hypothesis should be testable in a reasonable and also amount of time. And when the best hypothesis should not be used if and cannot be tested in the reasonable amount of time, because one cannot spend a lifetime and connecting evidence to test it. And hypothesis must explain the fact that prompt the explanation, and this means that by combining the hypothesis with other well-known and accept their generalization, the original problem and condition should be deducted. As a result, hypothesis must explain what it purport to explain. And null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis, I explained, it is very interesting. They are null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. So let's start. The term null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis are frequently used in statistical analysis. So the null hypothesis is what we call the idea that if we compare method A to method B, suppose in term A superiority and proceed on the assumption that both way are equal good. In contrast, we may believe that method A is superior, so the method B is inferior, in which case we are proposing an alternative hypothesis H0 and denotes the null hypothesis. So while HA denote the alternative hypothesis. So before the sample is drawing, the null hypothesis and alternative hypotheses are chosen. Basically, the researcher must avoid the error of deriving the hypothesis from the data, and that he collect and then testing the hypothesis from the same data. So there are the following some consideration. I explain some consideration are frequently kept in the mind while choosing a null hypothesis, such as their number one, basically the alternative hypothesis is usually the one that you want to prove, and whereas the null hypothesis is the one you want to disprove. As a result, a null hypothesis denote the theory we are aiming to rule out, and whereas the alternative hypothesis denote all other possibilities. So next the point I also explain, if the rejecting a hypothesis when it is true entail the high risk, and it is the considered the null hypothesis sends the chance of rejecting. So it when it is the true and is there are then which is chosen to be very small. So another point I explain, the null hypothesis should always be a specific hypothesis, meaning that it should not declare or approximate a value. So it is in most cases we proceed with hypothesis testing, usually the null hypothesis, while keeping the alternative hypothesis in mind. Why so? So the explanation is that if the null hypothesis is correct, one can assign the probabilities to various possible sample findings, but this is not possible if the alternative hypothesis is used. As a result, the null hypothesis is frequently used. Basically, there are no about the level of significance, must carefully listen. In the context of hypothesis testing, this is the circular idea. So it is always a percentage, such as the 5 typical that should be determined with the considerable care and considerable logic. There H0 will be rejected if the significance level is set at 5%. So if there are the hypothesis 0 is true, the sampling result has a probability of the less than 0.05. In other words, a 5% level of significance indicate that the researcher is ready to take a 5% chance of rejecting the null hypothesis H0. So if it turn out to be a true, as a result, the significance level is the greatest value of the probability of rejecting there are the hypothesis 0 when it is true, and which is normally calculated before the hypothesis is tested. So definitely they are very interesting for the decision rules. Basically, what is the rule and test of hypothesis? So let's start. There are the we establish a decision rule based on a hypothesis. There are the hypothesis 0 and alternative hypothesis, they are HA, according to which we accept basically. And there are the H0 such as the rejected HA and or rejected their H0. For example, if their H0, that's what a certain lot is good, becoming very few defective things, and H1 state that the lot is not good, so there contain to many defective items. So we must choose the number of item to be tested, as well as the certain their criteria for accepting or rejecting the hypothesis. We might evaluate 10 times in the lot and make a choose based on the fact and that it won none or only one is defective. So we will accept the hypothesis 0, otherwise we will reject hypothesis 0, and basically they accept hypothesis 1. And the term for this defined on the foundation is decision rules. So here we can find their type 1 and type 2 error basically defined. Suppose there are generally two types of the error that we might make them testing theories, basically when their hypothesis 0 is true, and we may reject it, and when their hypothesis 0 is false. So we may accept it and type 1 error and the first, and type 2 error the second. So put in the another way, type 1 error refer to the rejection of hypothesis that should have been accepted, and type 2 error refer to the acceptance of hypothesis that should have been rejected. So type 1 error is represented by the letter plan alphabetically, also known as the level of significance of the testing. So and type 2 error is represented by the letter B alphabet, also known as the level of significance of the test. So the chance of type 1 error is usually calculated and ahead of the time and referred to as the significance level of testing, the hypothesis testing. If the type 1 error rate is fixed at 5%, we will reject the hypothesis 0 about 5 times out of 100 times. We can change type 1 error by addressing them and the lower level. For example, if we set it to 1%, we can argument that maximum probability of the making type 1 error is merely 0.01. And when we strive to reduce type 1 error and with a fixed sample size n, the likelihood of committing and the type 2 error increases, and both type of fault cannot be eliminated at the same time, and there is a trade off between two types of error, and which means that we can only reduce the likelihood of making one types of error if we are ready to increase the likelihood of making the error. To deal with this trade-off in the business and decision making, look at the cost or penalties associated with both type error and determine the acceptable degree of type 1 error. If a type 1 error entail the time and both reworking a batch of chemical that should have been accepted, and versus the type 2 error including the risk of poisoning and the entire population of the user of this chemical substance. So then a type 1 error should be preferred as a result. While testing of hypothesis, one must set a very high threshold for type 1 error, and 2, as the result while testing hypothesis every effort must be made to achieve and the appropriate balance between the type 1 and type 2 mistake. So now we find out the test of hypothesis. There are the parametric test or standard test of hypothesis. It is very important. And number 2, there are the non-parametric test and or distribution free test of hypothesis. So parametric test typically make assumption about the parent population from which we sample, and before parametric test can be performed, an assumption such observation come from a nominal normal population and sample size is high, and assumption about the population parameter like mean, their variance, and so and must hold true. And however, there are times when the researcher is unable or unwilling to make such assumption. In such case, we employ non-parametric test, while our statistical procedure for evaluating hypotheses that do not rely on any assumption about the parameters of the parent population. And furthermore, most non-parametric tests assume just the nominal or ordinal data, whereas the parametric test require at least an interval scale of measurements. So as a result, to get the same size of type 1 and type 2 errors, and non-parametric test require more observation and then parametric test. So there are the important parametric tests, as there are Z test and T test and X square test and F test. In some cases, the population may not be normally distributed, yet the test will be applicable on account of the fact and that we mostly deal with sample and the sampling distribution closely approach their normal distribution. So their Z test, first of all, I explained the Z test is a statistical test and that is based on the normal probability distribution and is used to determine the significance of various statistical measures, and primarily the mean for determining the significance of the measure in questions. And the appropriate test statistics Z is calculate the compared to it is the probable value, and so add a set of level of significance. So in research investigation, this is the most commonly utilized test. This test is employed even when a binomial or the t distribution is appreciated on the assumption that such a distribution tend to resemble the normal distribution as the n increase. So in the event of large sample or when the population variation the Z test is commonly employed to compare the mean of a sample to some hypothesis means for the population. In the case of the large sample or when the population variance is known, the z-test is also used for determine the significance of difference between the means of two independent samples. When n is big, the z-test is also used to compare the sample proportion to a theoretical estimate of population proportion or to judge the difference in the proportion between two independent samples. This test can also be used to determine the significance of metrics like the median, mode, and coefficient of the correlation among others. So it is very interesting. Sometimes the researcher depends on the z-test and also t-test. The t-test is based on the t distribution and is considered and the appreciated test for the determine the significance of a sample means or difference between the means of two sample. In the case of small sample, they are smallest and unknown population variance, basically in which case we use variance of the sample as an estimate of population variance. So when two samples are related, we utilize the feared t-test, also known as the different test. So to determine the significance of a mean difference between them, it can also be used to determine the significance of simple and spatial correlation coefficient. So the relevant test statistics, the t is calculated from the sample data and then compare to it is the probable value based on the t distribution. So basically here you can see there to be read from table that given probable value, and for accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis at a specific level of significance for concerning degree of the freedom, it should be highlighted that the t-test is only applicable when the population variance is unknown and the sample size is small. So also another test I explained that x square test. Basically x square states is based on chi-square distribution, and and as the parametric test is used for comparing the sample variance and the theoretical population variance also. And I explained about the F test. F test compare the variance of two independent sample and is based on the F distribution, and this test is also used in conjunction with analysis of variance. Suppose the ANOVA basically ANOVA to determine the significance of several sample means at the same time. It is also used to determine the importance of numerous correlation coefficient for the accepting and rejecting the null hypothesis. The test of statistics F is calculate and compare to it is the probable value, and so as well as F ratio table and different degree of freedom for higher and smaller variants as the specific level of significance. So first of all, what are the variables? Basically in statistic and research, variable are item you measure and modify and control. Every study look a variable such which can be a person, a place, an item, on the idea. The value of variables can differ between the group or over time. If the variable in and the experiment is a person, eye color, suppose for example the value can vary from the person to person, from brown to blue to green. So there are the variables. And also when you will study there the type of variables, basically there are independent variables and dependent variables and intervening variables, and also there are moderating variables, and also control variables and extremes variables and quantitative variables. So there are the many variables, qualitative variables and confounding variables and composite variables. So there are many variables also important. So first I explain about the independent variables. Basically an independent variable is a single features that is unaffected by the other factor. In your experiment, an example of the independent variables is age, and it's take no difference where someone lives and what they eat and or how much exercise it get. And independent variables on the other hand can affect other variables. In study, the researcher frequently try to figure out if and how an independent variable affects other variable, and dependent variable basically other components can influence and affect a dependent variables. A dependent variables is an exam grade and which is determined by the things such as how much sleep you had and how long you studied. An independent variable can have an impact on different variables. So while the different variables cannot have a impact on independent variables, for suppose their example, the time you spend studying, and there are the dependent can influence your test grade. This is the independent. So but your test grade has no bearing on the time you spend studying. So when analyzing relationship between the study object, researcher often try to determine what make the dependent variables change and how. It is very interesting. And intervening variables also known as mediator variables and is a theoretical variable used by the researcher to explain cause of relationship between the other study factor, usually depend and independent variables. Instead of the observation, they are associations. The if money is the dependent variables and the long life and duration in the dependent variables. So researcher can hypothesis that access to high quality healthcare is the connecting variable between the two. So moderating variables, very interesting. They are moderating by boosting or diminishing the effect of intervened variables. Moderating moderator variable alter the relationship between dependent and independent variables. For example, such as the age. Age is a moderating variables in a study looking at the associate between the economic status and how often people there undergo physical exam from a doctor, and this connection could be weaker in the younger people and stronger in the elder people. So it is important. And also the control variables, the characteristics that are stable and do not vary during a study are referred to as the control or controlling variables. So other factors are unaffected by them. To avoid the base, and researcher might give a control and variable constraint throughout an experiment. And control variables in a plant development, the experiment, for example, can include the amount of fertilizers and water and case the plant receive. These levels are constraints so that the plants grow in the unaffected. So extraneous variables are a variable that affect the dependent variables but were not originally considered by the researcher when designing the experiment, and these undesired the variables have the potential to influence the outcome of a study or how the researcher preserve those results accidentally. And consider a study comparing the effectiveness of the prevents coaching and against the online course in the boosting student Spanish test of the score and parametric and the parental support and prior understanding of the foreign language and socioeconomic status are example of the unintentionally influenced variables. So there are the quantitative variable, basically discrete and continuous. Two types of quantitative variables. Quantitative variables are any data set involve the number of amounts. Example of might include height, distance or number of items. So researcher can further categorize and quantitative variables into two types. Discrete, basically any numerical variables that you can count realistic and such as coin in your wallet or money in your saving account also. This is the discrete and continuous numerical variables that you could never finish counting, such as the time. So it is important. And also qualitative variables such as the binary, nominal and ordinal. Quantitative or the category variables, and non-numerical variables and grouping. Example might include eye or hair color, and researcher can further categorize qualitative variables such as the binary variables with only two categories, such as male or female, red or blue. And nominal variables, you can organize the more than two categories that do not follow a particular order. And take the example housing type, such as the single family home and condominium tiny home. And ordinal basically variable you can organize in more than two categories, that is the follow a particular order. Take is the example level of satisfaction and unsatisfaction and natural and satisfied. So their confounding variable is very important. Basically confounding variables is one you do not account for, that can observe the impact of another one, and confounding fact might invalidate your experiment result by the basing them the implied relationship and between the variables when there is not. For example, if are looking at the association between the activity level, so there are the independent variable and dependent variable, but you do not account for the effect of age on these variables, it become a confounding variable that alter your findings. And composite variables, last I explained, a composite variable is created by the combining two or more variables to create a more complicated variable. If you use other factor in your experiment to measure and general health, such as the weight, blood pressure and chronic pain, and you have a composite variable. So today's lecture, there are the different type of variables I explain, and also I explain of testing of hypothesis. So thank you to all, and if you are new, must you will subscribe my channel and press bell icon for notification new classes. Basically my channel totally on the geography classes, and also their research guide, research guidelines, and many video must will visit my channel, and also visit my description. There are the different link of another video lecture classes. Thank you to all.